Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Lately there's been a lot of attention on the new civs and their quirks, but what about other recent changes to older civilizations? One that jumps out to me is the change from obsidian arrows for the Mayans to their new Hul'che Javelineers unique tech. It adds a second projectile for all variations of the skirmisher, including the Geniteur team unit. Now, unlike the Chukanu, whose extra arrows do 3 pierce damage though, the extra javelin in this case always does 1 damage to any target, regardless of armor, unit type, or upgrades. Every time you attack, you're just getting 1 extra damage dropped somewhere randomly in the area of the unit you're attacking. Now, you've probably already noticed that the accuracy isn't great, but let's try to put some numbers to it. I have a test here with a 100% accurate skirmisher at close range to count the number of shots. Beside it, we have 2 Mayan Hul'che skirmishers, one with thumb ring and one without. It turns out thumb ring doesn't impact the second projectile's accuracy, but I thought I'd check just to make sure. At point blank range like this, the secondary javelin has only a little over 75% accuracy, which is extremely low for being this close to the target. At longer ranges, a generic skirmisher itself only has around 93% accuracy without thumb ring, though thumb ring brings that up to 100% against non-moving targets. At this distance, the secondary javelin falls to around 50% accuracy. Considering the actual Hul'che or Atlatl is only meant to throw 1 spear at a time, 50% accuracy on the second spear arguably isn't that bad. Now, the fact it always does 1 damage means that even if you miss, any units you hit accidentally are technically taking the full impact as it rounds up. Like the Arambai, this is going to work much better against units that are tightly packed together for obvious reasons. So now that we know how the second projectile works on paper, let's try some practical tests to give a sense of how much an advantage it gives in some different matchups. To start with, I ran a few tests against other skirmishers. At close range and fairly bunched up, 40 versus 40, Mayans ended with 14 units left over. You can imagine how that level of advantage could easily snowball in practice. Trying again with the non-Mayan side in staggered formation, which should theoretically help dodge more of the stray shots, the Mayans ended with 10 instead of 14 units left. It's not a huge difference, but probably a bit more ideal to have them in that formation. In a couple of other configurations I tried, I found Mayans always seem to end with somewhere between 8 and 12 units left over when we start 40 versus 40. The point is, it gives a clear edge for Mayans, though remember skirmishers have bonus damage against other skirmishers. The main javelin is doing 4 damage, while the extra one is doing just 1. In a best case scenario, when both javelins land, you're getting something like 25% more damage, and judging by the number of javelins on the ground, you're getting significantly less than that. Against the Vietnamese Imperial Skirmisher, which has 7 more HP and 1 more bonus against other skirmishers, you can see Mayans are clearly outclassed. Aztec skirmishers, on the other hand, with extra range and attack, but 2 less pierce armor, are a bit more debatable. Personally, I think the Aztecs' extra range is incredibly useful, but with less armor, you could argue Mayans are better. They certainly win in a direct fight like this without micro. Switching things up, let's now take a look at how they do against Ethiopian Arbalesters, a unit you might create skirmishers against. It turns out the Arbalest does 2 damage to a Mayan skirmisher, with the skirmisher doing 7 with a chance for 8 damage. Notice that the extra javelin landing only increases your damage by 14%, and most of the damage here is happening because of the elite skirmisher's bonus against archers. As a baseline, in a 40 versus 40 fight, generic skirmishers come out with around half of their units left over. It's basically the exact same result if you switch them to Mayans, which just tells me the impact of the additional javelin is being drowned out by the variation that already exists in the outcome of fights. If your enemy is really tightly packed together, you're obviously getting some extra damage, but despite looking really scary for the archers, compared to the size of their bonus damage, it doesn't really move the needle. Another example of the same idea is against Halberdiers, who go from taking 6 damage to a possible 7. In other words, you'll be taking them out in probably 9 shots instead of 10. Again, in practice that means they're better, but not that much better against Halberdiers, since the majority of the work is being done by the main javelin. Mayan skirmishers will still be incredibly effective against spear units at long range and fairly balanced when fighting up close. Now, these 2 cases might paint a misleading picture though, since bonus damage accounts for so much of the calculation. A highly inaccurate extra +1 damage doesn't seem like a lot in these cases, but what about against units they're normally weak against? A classic counter to skirmishers is, of course, the champion. In that case, the extra projectile means they go from taking 2 damage to 3. In practice, with a bit of inaccuracy, that'll mean taking them out anywhere from 5 to 10 shots sooner, depending on the distance. Mayans don't have good champions themselves, and the Eagle Warrior is terrible against champions, so as Mayans, you can't fight infantry with infantry. You need ranged units for that, and if you're out of gold and can't afford archers or siege, that means relying on skirmishers. The fact they do up to 50% more damage to champions and other similar infantry means the tech is doing heavy lifting in exactly that sort of desperate situation. Contrast that with their previous unique tech obsidian arrows giving +6 against buildings. That mostly became relevant when you're already winning with a massive crossbows or arbalests pushing into an opponent's town. That's not to say Mayan skirmishers are now going to do well against champions as a counter, they're definitely not. But 50% more damage is 50%, and that's nothing to scoff at. Another very common matchup, in this case because they're both trash units, is against the Hussar. This case makes the tech look even better, since they normally take 1 damage from skirmishers. That means the second projectile is essentially just as strong as the regular one, assuming it lands. Of course, it's not 100% accurate, but Hussars are a slightly larger unit, so we would expect them to be hit more often. The second projectile is also affected by ballistics, meaning the extra speed isn't a major concern. Of course, they'll never hold up to Hussars in close range, but the point is they go from completely terrible to mostly terrible, or whatever 50% better than completely terrible is. The same sort of argument is going to apply to any high pierce armor unit, like onagers, rams, heavy cavalry, etc. Since they all take just 1 damage from skirmishers, the additional projectile doubles or nearly doubles their attack, especially against large units or tightly packed groups where missed shots are likely to land. Overall, the point is, against archers and halberdiers, you're unlikely to notice much of an improvement, which is fine as those are units the skirmisher is already good against. Instead, this ends up helping most in their worst matchups, which I think happens to be more useful. So now that we've seen how pierce armor, bonus damage, and the extra projectile fit together, let's take a look at buildings. To get a snapshot, against outposts with no pierce armor, I have a generic skirmisher, a Mayan one, a Saracen, and a Mayan with a Saracen ally. The Saracen team bonus was recently buffed again to +3 versus buildings, despite officially saying +2. At this point, it's now been +1 and +2, but secretly +3. I think the reason they did it this way is because the regular attack is negated by most buildings, so they end up just doing their 3 bonus damage, which then looks 2 more than the usual minimum of 1. Depending on the building, you will sometimes get the full +3 though. At one point, it was +5 for all Saracen archers, and then +3, +4, +5, scaling through feudal to imperial, and it's become easily the most tinkered with bonus in the game at this point. Personally, I think with all of the nerfs done to walls, they should just put it back to +1. That way, Incas also won't feel as bad about their team bonus. Getting back on track though, we can see the Mayans' secondary projectile isn't affected by a Saracen ally, though the main projectile is. The main takeaway is you're not getting double the benefit of the bonus as Mayans, and again, the extra projectile is always doing 1 damage. Having a Saracen ally is proportionally a bit better once you attack buildings with armor though, allowing them to go from 2 to 4 damage per attack. Again, the main projectile is doing its minimum now of 3 damage, and the secondary shot is doing 1. The main takeaway is that in most cases, Mayans will be doing double damage with their skirmishers to buildings at 2 damage instead of 1. That's significantly less crazy than the 16 times damage their Arbalesters were doing to gates with obsidian arrows back in the day, and 6 times damage they were doing to buildings recently. So with units and buildings out of the way, let's finish up by addressing a couple of interesting cases. It turns out they're one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Vietnamese team bonus for Imperial Skirmishers. They end up with 1 more pierce armor, 1 more attack, 1 extra attack against archers, plus the Mayans' additional projectile. There aren't a ton of bonuses for skirmishers, so being able to combine the Vietnamese bonus with the Mayans' unique tech creates one of the strongest combinations, up there with possibly Aztecs and Lithuanians for number 1. The most important question though is, of course, does it work with the going above and beyond cheat or any other self-respecting 256 times mod? The answer is a most definite yes. So to put it all together, I don't think the bonus adds a lot for skirmishers against archers or spears, which they normally excel against anyway. Instead, it's proportionally a much better deal against their worst matchups, making it a nice pickup in the late game if you think gold is going to be a concern. It's fairly cheap at 300 food and gold and should give a lot of long-term value. Against buildings, you have a similar effect of doing double the damage against them, again, just making Mayan skirmishers a bit more well-rounded. I feel like it changes the identity of Mayans a bit overall and makes the Arbalest a lot less interesting, indirectly making the plumed archer a more appealing choice. Hopefully all of this helps put the tech into perspective, but that's going to be all for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.